Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. In an unscheduled event, I'm not live, so I didn't warn you of this last week because I wasn't aware that I wasn't going to be, but I'm afraid an urgent appointment came up that I had to go to, so you have me pre-recorded. But please do continue to chat, say hello, say where you're watching from. There will be staff who will be able to respond to that working on the day, but also if there's anything specific that I need to get back to, then I will certainly do that over the next day or two. If you haven't viewed any of these before, then welcome. It's nice to have you with us. My name is Lorna Steele. I am the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service, and my job involves basically connecting people to the records we look after. And we look after such a wide variety of documents covering about 750 years, so all sorts of different subjects and themes. And we're glad to have you with us this week if you're joining for the first time. If you're joining again, then also welcome. Before I go any further, just to say, as regular viewers will be used to, this event is brought to you by High Life Highland at no charge to the viewer. And High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland. So the event requires no payment and no subscription, but we do welcome donations towards the work of the Highland Archive Service. So if you're able to donate, then there's a link included for you to do so if you wish to. This event you'll see is entitled Further Stories of World War I. That's because we covered World War I some weeks ago as an initial overview. As those of you will know who have watched several of these, my initial thinking with this series was to target school children, to work with them while they were homeschooling, and that did happen. But the interest that has carried on has been with adults as well, and so I thought I would revisit this with less of a general overview and just some more examples of stories from within our collections on this subject. And it's just a subject that so many people care about and are interested in. So just a very quick reminder of the dates involved, although I'm sure you'll be familiar with them. But World War I started in July 1914, on the 28th of July. Britain joined in the war on the 4th of August 1914, so very quickly. And the war was fought predominantly between the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allied powers being, again, predominantly the UK, France and Russia, and then others came in through the course of the war, maybe notably the United States. And the Central powers, the opposition, were Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. And when I say that, those are kind of big country names that I'm stating. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the contribution from Commonwealth countries, from all sorts of other nations who supported that effort. But those are generally the countries associated with the Allied powers and the Central powers. The war lasted 4 years, so it ended on the 11th of November 1918. Again, I'm sure that's a date you will all be familiar with, the armistice being signed. And the Allied forces had, of course, won the First World War. But that victory came at a cost of around 20 million lives, a huge, huge figure and a massive blow to all the nations involved. And within that, it's estimated there are about 75 to 150,000 Scots. So a large number, but very hard to get a good estimate on that. So quite a substantial figure anyway. Last time, if you watched World War I, you'll maybe remember that I talked a little bit about some of the stories of people in our records. So I spoke about Ian Forsyth, who was a farmer in Ballintrad Farm in Rossshire. I spoke of Alan and Donald Cameron of Lochiel, who were from Lochaber, and one of the two brothers, one of whom lived and one of whom died, and David Barrigill Keith, who was from a family from Thurso. So if you didn't get round to watching that, then please do go back and have a look. We'll give you some additional stories from our collections about the First World War. This week I'm going to tell the story of William John Wilson, the linked stories of the Smith and Matheson families, and tell you a little bit about some of the forestry workers who came to the Highlands during the First World War. My aim for this really is to give an insight into home life conditions during the First World War in the Highlands, and also an insight into some of the things that people experienced overseas and how things changed in both places through the course of the war. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the story of William Wilson, and I think, bear with me, I've got a picture of him to show you. So this is William. I'm conscious it's a little bit tricky to see with the reflection and so on, but this is a picture of William Wilson. So he was born on the 31st of August, 1891. So just about this time of year. He was one of 6 children who were born to Alexander and Elizabeth Wilson. When he was aged 19, he started his own business. It's quite amazing when you think of a 19-year-old going out starting their own business. He was a hairdresser, and he opened his own hairdressing business at 87 Academy Street in Inverness, and he lived in Huntley Street, so right in the middle of Inverness. Aged 24 in 1915, he married a lady called Barbara Mackey, with whom he had a family. So that obviously 1915, the war is already started, but he's still just young. And then during the First World War, he signed up and joined to serve in the Gordon Highlanders. He had another 2 brothers as well who served, and we'll see this when we come to talk about the Matheson family as well, but so many families, and you'll maybe be familiar with this with your own family trees, but so many families with several children, several brothers fighting at the same time. And I think it's difficult for us to imagine, I think, unless anyone watching is from a military family, to imagine the constant pressure that must put on the family, knowing that several of the children are in a danger zone. It must be very, very draining and wearing. So he went off to serve in the First World War. And in March 1918, he was defending the Western Front, so the area of France and Belgium, which is predominantly where British troops served, where Scottish troops served. And he was serving there when he was taken prisoner by German forces. It was following the Battle of Cambrai. He was initially reported missing. And again, I think it's hard for us to imagine just the level of fear for the family who get the initial notification that your loved one has gone missing, and then you're waiting for a follow-up notification if one comes. And it would be very hard, I think, not to imagine the worst. But eventually a postcard came to his wife to inform her that he was no longer missing, but that he was alive, but that he had been taken into a prisoner of war camp run by German forces. And when this postcard arrived home, this made a big impact in Inverness, and it obviously affected his own family, but it was announced in the local newspapers that the papers were very much aware of how, keeping communities up to date with what was happening with, their boys when they were away. And so we have a copy of, we have the postcard sent to his wife, and we also have a copy of this announcement in the local paper saying that he had been taken to a prisoner of war camp. And then over the coming months, his wife Barbara received postcards and letters, and when you are able to have a look at them, you'll see they are kind of emblazoned all over with German writing stamped over the top, saying this is from a prisoner of war, this is coming from a detention camp, from a prisoner of war camp. Quite oppressive looking. And he writes back to his wife about his own health, about the conditions of the camp, about the lives of the other soldiers that he's meeting. And he obviously also requests, please write to me about my family. How's the child? How are you? What's happening with the family? And I think that would be fairly typical of the things that would be preying on people's minds while they were serving. It's also a good example of things being censored, and you can see that he mentions in his letters about what may or may not be censored within them. The good news about this story is that William Wilson was released at the end of the war, and he returned home in 1918. And we have within that collection of William Wilson's papers some documents and photographs of him and his wife celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in 1965. William died later that year, aged 74. But lovely to know that, having gone through something that would doubtless have been frightening and traumatic, that he got home, and he got home to his wife, and we have a beautiful picture of them in their 70s celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. So a story with a nice end. So that's William Wilson. So that was the first one I wanted to tell you a little bit about. The next one I wanted to touch on was a linked story, and this is the story of the Smith family and the Matheson family. And I've picked this to tell you about because it's very, very interesting. We hold this collection of letters, of ration books, of postcards, things like that. But what I find particularly interesting about this collection is that one half of the family stayed at home and had rationing and restrictions to put up with, and the other half went to war. So you can very much see the impact of both sides of those things on one family. So the family, it's the Matheson family that the collection is predominantly about. This was the marriage of Charles Matheson and his wife Mary Ann, and they had 9 children. They had, let me just read this so that I don't miss a child out, that would be the ultimate offence. Christina, Peter, Isabella, William, Donald, Simon, Anna, James, and John. So 9 children. And first of all, I'm going to tell you about Isabella and what happened to her family. So Isabella Matheson married George Smith. They married in 1910 and they lived in Douglas Row in Inverness. So again, a very central location within Inverness. And they had 2 daughters called Mary, who was born in 1913, and Elspeth, who was born in 1918. You'll remember in 1915 that William was in his early 20s. In 1915, George Smith was age 36, and he enlisted in the army and went for an appointment to join up at Cameron Barracks, which is still a very substantial barracks building in the middle of Inverness. And he was transferred into the Army Reserves. It's interesting to note that this is 1915, so this is before the Military Service Act of 1916. So at this stage, it's after the big push. So straight at the beginning of the war, a lot of young men signed up, keen to fight for their country, keen to support what they saw as the cause. As the news came home gradually about what the reality of that was, that started to tail off. So you see a lull then before the 1916 push, which is the Military Service Act, where conscription was introduced and it became compulsory. So it's interesting to me that George enlisted in between those periods. It was in 1915 that he tried to sign up. And as I say, he was transferred into the Army Reserves. But in 1917, so 2 years later, he was given a medical exam, which resulted in him being classified as fit for service at home only. So I'm just going to read to you exactly what it says on that. So it says that he is fit for service at home only and to be given sedentary work as a clerk, a storeman, a cook, an orderly, something of that type. So nothing too physically demanding. As it was, he served as an ironmonger. I just think it's the reason I pointed out when he signed up is I don't know, but I imagine it would maybe be quite difficult to be one of the young men who didn't go. And I think it's just interesting to note that he did try to go. He signed up and was obviously deemed that his physical health wouldn't permit it. So this collection shows what George and Isabella's life was like at home during the First World War. So we have ration cards for them. We have again, I'll get my wording right, the Inverness Borough Food Control Committee milk card. And that is a milk card for the whole family that records what the milk allowance is, so how many adults are in the family, how many children, and therefore what is their milk allowance. And then, as I said, we have their individual ration books. And it's interesting to note that even Elspeth, who was just a baby at the time, she was not even 1 year old, she had her own ration card as well. So we have that. If you watched my previous World War I talk, you'll maybe remember me talking about the Defence of the Realm Act and the huge implications of that piece of legislation. And I said at the time, and it's still very current, that legislation is something similar to what we're living with just now, which is emergency laws passed in a moment of crisis. So these laws give the government the power to do something without jumping through so many hoops, so they can quickly make snap decisions about things. And this is what happened in 1916. Well, the Defence of the Realm Act was a wide-ranging act over several years, but part of that in 1916 was the special military area that came in. And this covered the Highlands because it was deemed that the Highlands was strategically important to the war effort, and therefore the government wanted to control who was within the Highlands. So they were frightened of spies, and so they wanted to be aware of that everybody who was in the Highlands had a right to be there, and they weren't photographing, shipping on the coast or anything like that. And so everybody local was issued with registration documentation, local passes to prove their right to be in the Highlands. And we have those for George and Isabella Smith and their family. So that's one side. One side of the family, Isabella, one of those 9 children, her life with her husband was to be spent at home during the First World War, living with the huge constraints of rationing, of proving to the police that you were entitled to be in your hometown. So a huge change in way of life. And that's one side of this collection. But what I think is particularly interesting is in the same collection are the documents of the other side of the family. So while they were contending with rationing and DORA, Defence of the Realm Act, that's generally, if you ever hear me say DORA, that's what I'm talking about. I don't know an actual person called DORA. I think it would confuse me if I did. But Isabella's brothers, her 4 brothers, all went off to serve in the First World War. So William, Simon and James served in the army, and Peter served in the navy. And again, as I said with William Wilson, I think there's that kind of dual reality for somebody like Isabella. She's living at home with the restrictions, but also she's living with the constant fear that something will happen to those loved ones who are serving. And this collection from this side contains field service postcards sent home by the brothers from the front line. And I've got, if you were watching the early weeks, you'll know I've got all sorts of family papers of my own. But I've got some things here to show you that might be enable you to envisage what I mean, because obviously I can't take things from our collections home, but I can show you things from my own collection. And these are 2 field service postcards that I have from my great-granddad. And I have one here which is has German writing on it, and one which has French writing. And you can see that they're very, very simple. There's very little decoration involved in them. They're just, this one, if you can read that, says, "I am quite well, John," and that's all. So the purpose of the field service postcards was really not to relay a lot of information. It was really just to touch base with people at home, to say, to put it crudely, in a way, it's just to say, I'm still alive. That's the very basic aim of these postcards, to get a simple message across to home quickly. They're pre-written, as I say, so sentences could be scored through, so you would just delete as appropriate. So it would either say, "I am well," or "I have been injured," or "I've received your letter," and you just score through the ones that don't apply. And they would just sign them and date them and send them as a quick update. So they were very much quicker, but also they required no censoring, or if they did, it was a cursory censoring, because as you can see from something of that size, there's not a lot of scope there for long, detailed secrets and messages to be written on there. Although you can see on this one, I don't know if you'll be able to see that it does say that it's been passed by the censor. They're marked as well with these little postmarks. And these specify, they will tell you which field post office or army post office they've been sent from. So you can track exactly where they were sent from. An army post office was a little bit more substantial. A field post office generally was a building that was quite makeshift and was put into an abandoned building or a ruin and moved with the troops as they went. So you can get a little bit of social history from these as well, aside from the content. Another really interesting thing is in 1917, between May and June, the postcards shrink. The reason for that being that there was a paper shortage at the time. So if you compare ones from different dates, you can see that little glimpse into history, as well as the content that's written on them, which I think is fascinating. The other thing this collection includes is postcards from Christmas and New Year, so that's quite common. Again, I have some of these in my own collections of people writing to say Christmas wishes, best regards for the new year, a lot of sort of hopes that the war will be over and that the next year will be better. I mean, thank heaven, most of us watching this will not be living fighting in a war, but I think we can all agree with the sentiment of hoping the next year is a little bit brighter. Within this Matheson and Smith collection, there are some postcards sent home from the brother James in 1917. Now, he served in the Royal Horse Artillery, and it seems likely that that particular section of the military served in the Battle of Jerusalem. And so it seems likely that he would have done, because the postcard talks about Palestine and about that area. He also probably would have fought alongside Anzac forces, which becomes of interest in a second. So that's some of the things that can be found within that collection. And it's a nice thing to note again at the end of this one that after the war, Peter was discharged in 1918. He had trench, I'm going to say Nephitus. If anyone is a doctor, please correct me, but I think it's Nephitus, which is a condition, obviously specifically linked to being in the trenches. But he was discharged and he was awarded a medal in 1921. William returned and lived into the 1950s. Simon returned and lived till the 1960s. And James returned and emigrated to Australia with his wife and his child. And I don't know, but you'll know me enough by now to know that I often look at these things and just wonder to myself. And I wonder if the reason he emigrated to Australia was because of his time serving alongside Anzac forces. I don't know, but it's nice to note that the four brothers that went all came back. That's a lovely thing, and not something that will have happened to every family, of course. And I certainly don't think they would have come back unscarred and untouched by what they'd seen. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Forestry, but first of all, before I do that, just a reminder that this livecast is brought to you by High Life Highland and that there's no charge to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this event, although we do welcome donations if you're in a position to be able to donate towards our work. So yes, I just wanted to round off this one by telling you a little bit about the forestry workers. If it's something that either people know a lot about or they don't know about at all, and it's a really interesting part of Highland history and part of the First World War history. If you were watching when I spoke about AI welders and the Rose Street Foundry, you'll know that Highland Company had a huge input in the First World War and the Second World War. And we have a history of that in this part of the world, that we dedicate a lot of time and energy in our businesses to supporting national efforts, as do a wide range of other places. But it's interesting to see how many places in the Highlands contributed to the war effort. And so in the First World War, the supply of timber coming from overseas was that the whole supply chain was disrupted, and it became much, much harder for timber supplies to get through. And so very quickly we had a severe shortage of timber in the Highlands. So the Board of Agriculture in 1915, and again, you'll have to bear with me, I'm going to read them because these are, well, you see what you think. They're very short and clear titles. In 1915, they set up the Timber Committee, which wasn't very effective, and so later became known as the Directorate of Timber Supplies, and then became known as the Timber Supply Department of the Board of Trade. I'm not sure why changing the name so many times is relevant, but it happened. And so right through the First World War, this group of people controlled the timber stocks. They controlled all the production of timber, the importation of timber, the pricing, timber rationing. So a big remit of making sure that supply was enough to meet demand. 1 month after the US joined the war, which was 1917, halfway through or towards the end of the war, when the US joined, they became aware that the UK didn't really have skilled enough lumbermen or foresters to be able to quickly and easily work with this timber. And so money was raised, and they sent across enough supplies and machines to run 10 portable sawmills, and they sent across 350 men as well to run these logging units and sawmills. There were various types of these set up across the Highland, but I'm going to talk about one initially, and that is this one that the Massachusetts the group of people in Massachusetts set up to send units and men and supplies over to run. And this was based in Ardguy in Sutherland. All the 10 units were based within 5 miles of each other, so really quite close. And some of these were set on land that Andrew Carnegie, who I'm sure you'll be familiar with the name Andrew Carnegie, famous industrialist and philanthropist, because he was had his base at Skibo Castle, he provided some of the land for these timber units to be based on. And we've got some wonderful photos of this group of people, and they look really quite upbeat. You know, they look like they've got enough food, they've got enough supplies, and they're obviously working very hard. And you can see that in the image. And apparently their output man for man at that unit was the highest of any timber unit in the UK. And also in 1917, there was another one set up. The UK government set up Camp Morlach at just outside Lochmorlach near Aviemore, Rothiemurchus, Glenmore area. And they had a contingent of 70 or 80 men working there. And again, a huge international group of people. So there were Finns, there were Norwegians, there were people from Turkey, from Greece, from Argentina, all sorts of different nationalities converging. And they had a little wooden barracks built there to work to. They had a YMCA and a shop and a pub set up. And again, we have some images of this group of people. And one particular document we have is someone who wrote his memoirs down in the 60s or 70s, wrote down what he remembered about his time serving and he was a Norwegian, called Lars Skarpnes, serving at Camp Morlach. And he had written back because he was worried that those memories would be lost and that other people maybe wouldn't be interested in them. So he wrote his letter some 50 years after he'd worked there and just sent it to the township of Aviemore in the hope that somebody would be able to send it or get it to a place where it could be kept and where his memories of that time and the kindness that he felt he was shown by the locals, that would be kept somewhere and recorded. And so it's a real privilege for us to know that we hold that document now and that his memories are, treasured and looked after and kept safe. And if you can join us on Doors Open Day, I'll come on and talk about that in a second. One of our archivists, Jennifer, picked that as her favourite document for that exact reason, because it was that man's dream that his memory of serving in the First World War in the Highlands would be kept safe, and now it has been, and that's really special for us. So he talks in his letter about his free time associating with people in the community, getting to know the locals, and how much he appreciated that time. And anyone who is familiar with the Glenmore, Aviemore area will know that there is still a connection there to particularly the Norwegians who served there. And that's still a link that's held closely by that community as well. So I hope that's given you some insight into some other documents we hold. Half an hour is never really long enough. I feel like I could just chat away about all the things we hold, but hopefully that's given you an insight into some more of our documents. Next week, I'll be looking at a fantastic collection held in our Wick archive nucleus, and that's the Wick Harbour Trust records. So I hope you can join me for that next Thursday. And prior to that, I hope that you can join us for Doors Open Day. Now, if you're watching this on our Facebook page, you may be bombarded with films over the weekend. I have scheduled about 10 films to go out across the Saturday and Sunday, the 5th and 6th. I promise I will calm down after that. You won't constantly be bombarded with films. But what I really wanted to do was, it's been really nice for me to see how people have engaged with these chats and have been interested to know about what we do and what we care for. And so what I want to do for Doors Open Day, we would normally be hosting 100 people in our building, and we're not able to do so. And so what I wanted to do was broaden this out to other members of staff and give them a chance to chat about their favourite documents, why they love their job, what they do. Within our buildings, we house Highland Council registrars, we hold conservators, we have archivists, family historians, people who work with our online resources like Ambala. And so I wanted really just to give them a chance to have a say and you a chance to have a look at some of the things that they hold dear. So I really hope you can join us for those. They will go out every couple of hours over Saturday and Sunday. I'm going to round off by saying again that this livecast is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that this event requires no payment and no subscription, but that we do welcome donations if you are able to donate towards the work of the Archive Service. But thank you again for joining me. It's a real highlight of my week. Thanks.